So, first of all, I'll read a bit about who Andreas is, and then we'll start the conversation. So Andreas is a partner at Threshold, formerly DFJ Ventures. Correct me if I'm mistaken in any of the abbreviations. And a member of the firm's management committee. He currently serves on the boards of a number of private companies that are on enterprise infrastructure space and artificial intelligence. Before joining DFJ, you were in McKinsey, and you are summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Harvard College. And he was a Baker Scholar and graduated first in his class at the Harvard Business School. Okay, you told me not to mention that, but I think it's very good to know who we are speaking to. I think the most relevant, though, part of the conversation here is that you currently serve on the National AI Committee in Greece and on the board of the Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund. So, Andrea, great thanks for being here. You have many hats. And the first question is, what is the National AI Committee? Let's start with the basics. And why do countries need a national AI strategy to begin with?
Thank you, Yiorgos. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's a fantastic event. Like you said in the beginning, I'm really glad to see these kinds of events happening in Greece, and I'm really hoping that this becomes a trend. I know that the government and a lot of the research institutions and academic institutions are really trying to make Greece potentially a hub for certain aspects of what it is that we're going to be discussing today. So, my short bio, I've been a VC for 25 years, but I've stopped making new investments for the fund a couple of years ago. And as I'm thinking about our transition, I want to say our, I mean my wife, who is a professor at Stanford, and myself, coming back to Greece, we wanted to give back and to try to get more involved in public service, in nonprofits, et cetera. So I serve on a couple of public service boards, like the Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund. But this committee, this National AI Committee for Greece, is newly formed. It was formed in late October. It consists of primarily academics. I think I'm the only non-academic on the committee. And I think I was put there to kind of talk more entrepreneurship and startups. And the goal of the committee is to really advise the prime minister. It reports to the prime minister, and is to provide advice on things like policy, potential comparative advantages, and focus areas that Greece should look into in joining a whole bunch of other countries that have developed the national AI strategies. Now, very good question, why do you need one? And the way I've thought about it is, I think everyone's realized that we're fully in the information age. I mean, when I started in venture in 1999, I left McKinsey to go to venture capital because around me in Silicon Valley at the time, I saw a fundamental change that was happening with the adoption of the internet, making its transition from the academic sphere into the world at large. Mm-hmm. And of course, we were all over optimistic about how long it was going to take for a lot of these, let's say productivity gains and all that to fully take hold. And it always takes longer than you think. But I would safely say that 25 years later, it is 25 years after 1999 when I joined, 25 years later, I think everyone has realized that we're squarely in the information age. And what I mean by that is that what used to be a technology industry that was a subset of the GDP and, arcane investors in Silicon Valley and sort of at the time, old boys clubs would invest with each other, all that's gone. Every industry is a technology industry now. I mean, think of the percentage of the GDP that is not influenced by technological advances. It's quickly trending to zero, right? Maybe some areas of artisanal manufacturing and all that, and I would argue even there that's not the case. So why a national strategy? Why are countries and governments and prime ministers so interested all of a sudden? It's because I think society has realized that we're finally squarely in the information age. And what that means is that the dislocations that can be brought about by technologies as disruptive as GenAI have to be taken seriously. And instead of chasing after changes that happen to you, it is much easier to try to be a little preemptive, to try to be have a little foresight, and try to think about in this, let's say, reset of the global chessboard that's happening, what is the position of different areas, of different talents, of different skills, etc. We're all doing that for ourselves. We're thinking about what will our job, what will it look like 5, 10 years from now. Young folks like you who are setting on a career, I'm sure, are thinking about what will I be doing in 10 years and how different will it be from what I think I will be doing next year, right? So it's only natural that those kinds of discussions happen at the national level. One last point. Whenever you have a technological disruption or some sort of paradigm change, I mean, think about internet, right? Mobility, cloud. Usually, it's not the incumbents that necessarily are the winners of the next wave, right? They can be disrupted, and then, I mean, look at Microsoft. Microsoft's back at the top after kind of missing the whole cloud thing for years, right? And if you remember, when I was starting in venture, when we were investing in mobility, the giant companies that we had to contend with at the time were Nokia, Ericsson, what's the one from Canada we all had? BlackBerry, RIM.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Think about how disruption can create a whole new category of winners. So the last point about this is there's always a possibility for leapfrogging. So areas, countries, companies, folks that could have been behind in the prior wave, when the new wave comes on, may actually have a chance to leapfrog. So there's also for us on the committee this question of, are there areas specifically for Greece that could be leapfrogging opportunities that we should look into very seriously?
Excellent. Excellent starting points, and very encouraging, actually. The leapfrogging element is something that we want to dive deeper in this conversation. So, Andreas, what can smaller countries like Greece can really do to differentiate when GenAI is really about, massive spending of big companies or like rich countries that have their own foundation models?
So that's the $64,000 question, right? But if you look at other small countries like Singapore and Estonia, right, you see they have published national AI strategies about what they're doing. If you look at how they're trying to differentiate, they're picking their lanes. So I'd say it's something similar for Greece. We're in the process of looking at a whole bunch of different, let's say, factors, some of which have to do with, let's call them hygiene, bringing up the population. You talked about, or someone talked about digital literacy. Actually, you talked about digital literacy before. There's some must-dos, must-haves. Bring up digital literacy in the population, technological literacy. Like, this is just hygiene elements. You gotta do them just to catch up with a meso oro, with the averages, right? But the question is, are there areas where you can pick a lane, where you can truly differentiate and be globally competitive in something? So I'll give you an example. This is where small countries can potentially have an advantage. And Greece is living right now through an era where it has a huge advantage in that it went through the populist phase, right? We had, after the crisis, a populist phase, and in some ways that inoculated the population against the easy promises of populism. So they voted in a government that was actually a technocratic government that's kind of business-friendly and focusing on, doing a lot of different things, such as digitizing the state and what have you. And the advantage of being in a small country that has shed the populist, whatever you want to call it, chimeras or promises, is that you can make impact quickly. There's low-hanging fruit that if you go after, you can change the course of the ship in a much easier way than, let's say, the US, with 50 states and populists here and very big polarization could do. So for us, it's really a question of picking the lane. We're not at the point where we've made the recommendation, but I mean, if you look at all the national AI strategies of the other countries, I can tell you that the high-level components are all the same. Right. Talent and education, research and attracting research activity of a globally competitive scale. This actually fits very well with the potential start of private non-profit universities in Greece, finally, right? So R&D, talent, education, obviously the regulatory and legal framework. You can pick a lane as to how open, simple, non-bureaucratic do you want to be for attracting companies? So for example, Estonia has taken a position of trying to be particularly company-friendly. They differentiate on that. That's something that, if politicians wanted to do it, there's a way to actually do that. And then, very importantly, two other things, the public sector and using AI both for productivity gain, but also as a way of organizing data in an open way that can act as a beacon for companies and, let's say, R&D or intellectual property coming from outside into the country in areas of comparative local advantage. We can talk about that if you want for Greece. Sure, there's some theories about that. But also, frankly, the public sector itself as a potential investor and buyer of cutting-edge technologies in the same way that I would argue with gov.gr, where Greece went from one of the most bureaucratic and painful locales in terms of how people interacted with the state, leapfrogging all the way to, compared to the US, it's much easier here to deal with the public sector, online, right?
Andrea,
so huge jump.
Andrea, you have raised amazing topics. You are the pleasure of the moderator, I would say, because you have so much top content, and I would like to capture one by one if you want to make some comments on those points. So you raised the point of R&D and talent attraction. Let's start with that. What is your take on that, and what is a strategy about that?
So here's the interesting part. Cutting edge, you guys all know it, and you'll hear much more about it over the 3 days, but cutting edge research in Gen AI, interestingly, let's be honest, is not being pushed or done in the traditional academic institutions. The cutting edge stuff is really not, frankly, coming out of universities right now. It's coming out of the large companies. It's coming out of the Googles and the Metas and the Amazons, and it's coming out of cutting edge R&D facilities within these large companies.
Exactly.
Wait, from a government sort of viewpoint, that can be a little scary. Look at what's happening in France with a huge development of local Mistral and local LLMs. It's interesting. It's almost like a danger to national sovereignty that can be posed by large companies that now are investing literally tens of billions of dollars in building what can be the real assets of the future. It's a little scary, but it's also a reality, right? That some of the best researchers, if you want to attract them, it's not just the universities you have to talk to. You have to talk to the large companies.
Can we jump on since you mentioned Mistral, it's the French government bets big on open source, and they bet big on also pouring money on new companies that are gonna lead the French way of doing Gen AI. What's your take on it? How do you see that also from the National AI Committee standpoint?
Yeah,
please.
Greece is a smaller country, and we're obviously coming out of the crisis. We're still in relatively pretty tight fiscal discipline. So things that involve spending tens of billions of dollars for some large national initiative is really difficult, right? So I think for us here, it would have to be much more through public-private partnerships and attracting capital, but also talent in areas where we can argue we have a comparative advantage. I think the French with Mistral would tell you francophonie around the world is something that arguably needs to be invested in because it touches so many people, and it's also a matter of national identity and pride. So I'm not going to comment as to the pure economic return, let's say, business plan that goes there versus an existential need for them. But I'd say for us, just for a second, think about areas like πολιτική προστασία, right? Like areas of climate-induced national disasters. Whether we like it or not, Greece is at the California too, but Greece is at the forefront of the fires and floods, and we have the geography, right? Think of defense. Israel has a whole set of industries and a startup that came out of. We have thousands of islands where you need to kind of do border, securing and patrolling and stuff like that. Think of health. Health is an area where we're very far behind when it comes to digitization of electronic health records, but there's now a huge push to actually do that the right way. You could do it in an AI-ready way, and choose, for example, to be a country that wants to invite open access for the top researchers from around the world to come and use data in a systematic way.
And
These are
Andrea,
not easy, but there are ways.
Not easy at all. You mentioned already 3 verticals that could be like star areas for Greece. Is there any particular set of point strategies to really support those verticals, like how we can encourage the gathering of big data sets on them, on those areas, or particular VC money? I'm sorry for putting you on the spotlight. If there is a strategic plan for the particular verticals that you could share, maybe you cannot.
We're not at the point, this committee was just formed a couple of months ago, right? So we're not at the point where we have something to publish quite yet. We have, let's call them working assumptions. And we're doing work across all those pillars to kind of go and test those hypotheses, very much around the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Okay.
I'll be honest with you, from a venture perspective, and it's going to be very difficult to say Greece all of a sudden will become the venture hub of the world, right? Because we already have ecosystems that are kind of pretty well developed around that. But there can be particular verticals and particular areas that take advantage of the local future potential regulatory environment coupled with open data access under certain parameters that could, in fact, in some of those verticals provide a big advantage. And I would argue climate-related stuff, where we do have a lot of data, it's another question as to how well cleaned up and organized it is, but the data is out there. Potentially health of that has other issues, and 3 or 4 other verticals could be areas for us.
Let me just comment on here that we feel very lucky that you are in the committee as a non-academic, as you put it, and I totally agree. We need more practitioners, and I think the big reason why we wanted to invite you was that you wear all those different hats. So I think this is super helpful for the committee themselves as well to realize some practical issues about what you can bring as a knowledge.
I have to say, I've been very impressed with, Kostis Daskalakis, who's the head of the committee, professor from MIT, unbelievable guy, very practical, focused on, I'm really impressed with actually everyone on the committee, Kimon Drakopoulos, Vangelis Karkaletsis, a lot of great people on the committee, a lot of amazing legal experts and ethicists as well, top of the line, Fereniki, Panagopoulou, John Tasioulas, really, the point I'm trying to make here is Greece is also sort of unique. Maybe Israel is another country, there's another couple, but it has such a large diaspora that actually does pretty well in sort of academic and STEM fields around the world, but also in ethics and classics and in general academic disciplines around the world. So another sort of hypothesis for us, for the committee, but frankly for Greece in general, is how do you mobilize the power of the diaspora in a more organized way to be able to actually have leverage in some efforts that happen, whether they be public, private sector, or both. And this is something that I love seeing as the world's getting smaller and as digital nomads and as more and more of us can kind of work almost from anywhere. I think that's becoming much easier over time. And so if you ask me, I'm very bullish about places like Greece, because my thought is that if in the future we're not going to be working 40 hours a week, and it's not going to be about how shifts at the factory because the robots and the AI is going to be doing all the work, and for us the value add is going to be primarily in creativity and inspiration, and it's going to be less about how many hours you put in, but more about how many high quality insights did you actually generate. So it's measured in a different way. Then my theory is places like Greece that can provide the balance of quality of life coupled with, and that's what we need to work on, the infrastructure, right? To be able to get from creativity to actually doing something. Value of these kinds of places, like these kinds of geographies, should go up over time. I'm buying real estate in Greece, I'm just saying.
That's such a good start for the summit. Andrea, thank you so much. I would like to raise a couple of more topics, and we will open it to the audience. So prepare your questions for Andreas. it's our opportunity to ask him anything we wish for. So you mentioned the regulatory environment a couple of times. You're not the expert in the committee about that, but if you want to share a couple of points about what can be done, and also as guidelines for other national committees, we start having a lot of people from different countries, so that might be interesting to the international audience as well.
So let me one step back, right? So clearly AI has a lot of potential for good, but it's also a very scary thing to a lot of people. And frankly, as with every other technology wave, because it sells papers, let's call it, sells news, stories that try to, maximize the potential negative implications of the AI, the Terminator, let's call it the Terminator scenario of the AI, the artificial general intelligence takes over and it takes over the computers and we're all dead. Those kinds of stories sell a lot of, let's say, get a lot of clicks in the early days of every new industry, right? So the idea that regulation can stop something from happening, I think is ludicrous, right? The technology moves one way, it always moves forward. We are not the ones that control technology, technology controls us. I mean, I fundamentally believe that's a more philosophical conversation we can have separately. Be that as it may, you still, especially in areas that have ethical implications, which clearly artificial intelligence and private data and all that do, clearly you need to put the guardrails. Usually those guardrails follow the cutting edge, because by definition, we don't even know how some of this stuff's gonna be used, so it's very difficult to predict beforehand what it is that's gonna go wrong and regulate it before it actually happens. Look at the internet, with all the acts about safe harbors for companies and search and what have you. It kind of has to follow the development. So right now in Europe, there's let's call it a very generative conversation about the AI Act. And there's a lot of sort of negotiations between countries as to how strict and how specific do we need to be in regulating companies that are working on AI algorithms before we kind of know what we're gonna be dealing with. I think something's gonna pass at the high level, and I think it's probably a good thing that something passes, and I think in general, the way that they're approaching this idea with like defining high risk versus low risk categories is the right way. That said, it will give a lot of degree of freedom, like GDPR did. It will give degrees of freedom to local countries in terms of how they interpret the high-level act into what it actually needs to happen locally. And in the same way that, for example, Germany has a different way of implementing GDPR versus France or other countries with the implications that has, same thing will happen for AI. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're looking into is if there is political will, that's not up to us, we're the supposedly experts, right? But if there's political will to put yourself on the, like Estonia, let's say, on the more company-friendly side of that equation, and for example, create sandboxes, which is a concept within the AI Act, sandboxes in particular verticals, maybe with even safe harbor type protections for companies that work for, let's say, the public good in certain areas. That could be an attractive way of actually getting companies to choose to do some of the cutting edge research in Greece because they are afforded that kind of protection. So it is something we're looking into.
Yep, perfect. Andrea, last question from my side. Do you have certain examples, case studies from abroad? We mentioned a few that are your top models, let's say, representation models that you would like to follow, or also you live in the US. What do you see there that you would like to bring, not mimicking it, but bring it here in Greece?
Look, the thing Silicon Valley has that's very difficult to replicate.
That's a very lively event.
Yeah. is an ecosystem. Everyone talks about the importance of ecosystems. They're easy to kind of analyze after the fact. They're extremely difficult to engineer from the top down. And what I mean ecosystem is you've got the universities, but you also have the funding, and you have relatively sort of stable regulations, et cetera, right? So that's difficult to. So I'd say the US, areas like Silicon Valley, other areas, Boston for biotech, they've got these ecosystems that took generations to form and have a way of self-perpetuating themselves. That's really difficult. So we all talk about it, hard to replicate top down. So I'd say the things that I like, because we've talked to a lot of people from other committees like Canada and France and Singapore and what have you. What I like, I'll just 2 or 3. Singapore, as a small country, has been extremely aggressive in courting the right companies to come to them, like extremely aggressive. It's the kind of won't take no for an answer sort of attitude that a small country, I think, needs to have to attract the best folks and the best kind of talent in there. So that's one example. Canada started very early with the AI because they have amazing universities that have been fantastic in producing that. So their first strategy back in 2017 or so was all about the academic institutions. And what I liked about them is that they didn't add 50 goals. That they started simple. They started with let's just make these institutions top in their field and really invest in these 3 areas. And then 2 years later, they came back and said, okay, we did that. Now it's all about translational research from universities to the world at large. What do we do there, et cetera. So taking a more staged approach where you're not trying to do everything at once, I like that a lot. So those are 2 quick examples.
Are going to be a lot of iterations and a lot of failures and lessons learned. So we would like to get some questions from your side. Any questions, please? Raise your hands.
So, hi, thank you for coming to this event and for organizing this. I'm Inas. And my question is that, do you believe that GenAI will kill entrepreneurship in the long term? And I mean it in a way that when you're a startup, during this year, for example, you create your website, you rank it on Google, it's quite straightforward. But with GenAI and ChatGPT, everything goes through this page, and if you ask, for example, for a software solution to ChatGPT, ChatGPT will get you back to the most established results. So, in a way...
Yeah. So this is an interesting story. We invested actually back in the day in what was GoTo, right? Which was the first search engine that actually allowed for an auction of results. It's actually what then Google, when it was looking for a business model, basically copied, and they ended up paying about $1 billion to GoTo, that became Overture and all that, but who cares, right? So this question of how do business models get, let's say, co-opted by technology waves is definitely one that's going to be going on for a while, and it has applied to every other technology change, so it will apply to GenAI as well. But here's my higher kind of thought about that. My meta, let's say, thought about that is we don't know how GenAI is going to like the obvious first set of applications of every new medium when there's a paradigm shift in media. The obvious first applications are just copying what you did before in a more efficient way, right? So the first TV programs were radio shows where people in front of a mic but with a camera and they looked good, right? But it was a radio show but on camera, right? And the first internet stuff was basically newspapers on a screen, a digital newspaper. But then think of how, let's say, social media, think of trends that are completely different from what we would have thought when the medium first appeared. Here, we're not talking about medium, we're talking about an underlying technology, but I guess what I'm saying is, I don't even know if there's going to be such a thing as a website. And therefore, this thing about search results or what have you may be completely irrelevant, right? It may be that the creativity of giving insight to something that's GenAI powered may have to do more with privileged data, let's say, that you have in a way that you can append or somehow classify differently and allow a large foundation model to be fine-tuned in a way that's unique to something that's you. And in that case, the LLMs are not going to be the threat because you're... So what I'm saying is, if the question is, will human creativity, meaning entrepreneurship as human creativity and passion and energy, will that get co-opted by technology as smart as GenAI might be? I don't believe it. It does get to be a pretty philosophical discussion at some level, and I don't want to have it now. It may even get spiritual. But at the end of the day, I always believe that human creativity trumps any kind of technology wave because it reinvents itself.
Excellent. Just a note here that Andreas is going to be coordinating the panel about VC and startups at 5:30 on this stage with Nico Bonachos from General Catalyst, Alexandros Eleftheriadis, partner at Big Pie, and Dr. Haris Lambropoulos, who is the president of the HDBI, the Hellenic Development Bank of Investments. So keep your questions for that side, but that was an excellent point, and this is why I'm refraining to ask you VC and startup questions that I have so many. So we'll take, if you are okay, Andreas, with that, 2 more questions. Do you have time? Is it okay with the audience? Because we just ran out of time. Okay, we have 1 more question here and 1 more there, please.
My name is George Kalivas, and I would like to make 2 very short questions. First one is, can Greece profit from data centers that are about to be established from Microsoft? And the second one is whether ancient Greece, I mean classical studies, can be used to help differentiate people from machines as we're getting into this Gen AI era, if we can profit from our tradition and culture in this aspect, as a differentiation aspect as well.
I'll start with the second one. I hope so. And Yannis Asael at Google, at DeepMind, and a bunch of other people are looking at those very questions, like how do we use, cultural, let's say, and even ancient texts as a way of actually getting insights that could be differentiated from typical foundation models based on the internet and, let's say, modern knowledge. So I think it's a very interesting set of questions, and there's better people than me looking into it, so I hope so. On the first one, I'd say data centers in general, we didn't talk about compute, because it's an area where there's some debate, right? For the compute that you need for training models like this, it's very different from the Microsoft or the Google typical data centers that are made for fast throughput and low latency. Here we're talking about cheap compute. So it's different kind of, let's call it data center or high performance computing center that you need. There is actually an argument to be made, and the committee is looking into it, and the government is looking into it, about Greece because of our green energy, because we have, they take a lot of energy to train these models, right? Because we have a very high percentage and ability to have local green, cleaner energy, that it could make societal sense to actually have one of those high-performance computing centers in Greece. And I mean one that's bigger than Daedalus, which is getting built as we speak already. Mm-hmm. That's a potential. There's also funds from Europe for the just energy transition that potentially could get directed towards that. So there's also new technologies that, because cooling is another big thing, is maybe you have some of them underwater. We have lots of water. So anyway, there's open questions about data centers in general, specifically high-performance computing, that it is a topic of open discussion.
Yeah, that is another big discussion. Thank you so much. 1 more question, please. I saw a raised hand.
Thank you. I'm Tassos Zakiridis. We see that Europe is far behind in terms of state-of-the-art companies and advancement in tech and GenAI, of course, in comparison with US and Asia. Do you think is that because of the strong regulations like GDPR, or is it the lack of investment from central bank in the years of crisis in these areas and the slow central planning for creating tech ecosystems in EU?
See, I don't think it's as much of a top-down thing in the sense that ecosystems are really difficult to build. They're not like, oh, government makes a decision, we're going to be an ecosystem, and then you spend money and it happens. It's a much more difficult process that takes a while. It actually involves a lot of different actors, only some of whom are state actors or state-funded actors, right? So I think Greece, for the past, I want to say, 10 plus years or so, like in some ways the crisis helped. The crisis was a financial crisis. It was a big kick in the pants of a lot of young people that couldn't just blindly follow their parents' advice of, get a safe job and be a toll collector or whatever. But it's like, well, those jobs don't exist anymore. We're going to have to go and find something creative, something new to do. So I think that actually helped spur that, plus with the internet, the stories diffusing, the ideas of success stories diffusing around the world, and people seeing the diaspora, other countries having stories of successful entrepreneurs breeds success. So the fact that we have a diaspora that now we've had now for several years through things like HDBI and others, funding support so that you can get more of these funds happening. I think there's the right steps that are happening in terms of an ecosystem. I'm an investor in 3 different Greek early-stage tech funds, and I can tell you, they have very good returns, right? Even on a global scale. Now, they're much smaller, but that's good because if they're smaller, they need smaller successes, and then success breeds success. The other organization I'm a part of is Endeavor. Endeavor is a nonprofit that is all about paying it forward, is all about using successful entrepreneurs to mentor the next generation. Yes, we are late to the party, but at least we're off and running to the races. And we've combined the diaspora with, hopefully a thoughtful government set of policies and the ecosystem happening on its own. And then the creativity of the Greeks at large and the entrepreneurship, which is something that characterizes us as a people. I'm optimistic. Maybe with that,
yes. Andreas, always a pleasure to have a discussion with you. Please, let's...